It's been a while. Sorry. Oh, we'll get started. We'll get started here. It's been a while. We've not had an event in like 3 weeks, so it's going to be getting back into the groove here. Welcome back to Exile and Bookville's Authors on Tap reading series. Tonight is a very special edition as we are hosting our first sort of hybrid event. Michael Zapata, he's actually here. He's not a hologram. Is our guest of honor tonight. Was nice enough to come to the store and join us live. Thank you, Mike, for doing that. We're here to celebrate the paperback release of The Lost Book of Adana Moreau, which came out today. Congratulations. It looks gorgeous. We'll talk about that in a minute. Mike will be in conversation with the ultra talented Idra Novey tonight. Let's learn a little bit about them before we get started. Michael Zapata is founding editor of Make Literary Magazine and the author of the novel, The Last Book of Adana Moreau, winner of the 2020 Chicago Review Books Award for Fiction, finalist for the 2020 Heartland Booksellers Award in Fiction, and a Best Book of the Year for NPR, the AV Club, LA Public Library, and BookPage, among others. He is a recipient of an Illinois Arts Council Award for Fiction and is on the core faculty of StoryStudio Chicago and the MFA faculty of Northwestern University. As a public school educator, he taught literature and writing in high schools servicing dropout students. He currently lives in Chicago with his family. Mike and I met, when the hardcover came out, and one of your first and your last.
One of the first and the last events. Yeah.
Right before COVID, before the pandemic happened. And it was at a different bookstore, but Mike and I met in a weird fashion. I had a party and Mike was there, and I had just received an advanced reader's copy of his book and was told to read it like explicitly by my local rep. I had no idea who Mike was, neither was at my party, but I didn't know who he was till after I started reading, after the fact that he had been at that party. We talked for hours, and it was weird to have that moment of, I didn't know who he was, and now his book is sort of breaking out, and then we hosted him. It was one of those organic things that I think we were talking about it in Chicago.
It was a very good party.
Yeah, it was a really good party. It was a really late party, but yeah, and we're so happy to host him again. Like I could host Mike every week for all the wonderful things. He's a great book citizen in Chicago. Idra Novey is the author of the novels Those Who Knew, a finalist for the 2019 Clark Fiction Prize, and Ways to Disappear, which received the 2018 Brooklyn Public Library Prize. It was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize for first fiction. Her translations include Clarice Lispector's The Passion According to GH, which is everyone knows it's an indie favorite. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. We just sold a couple copies in the last couple of days, so thank you. And a co-translation with, and I'm going to mess this up in ways you've never heard before, Ahmad Nadalizadeh of Iranian poet Garous Abdul Malakian, Lean Against This Late Hour, a finalist for the 2021 PEN America Poetry and Translation Prize. She teaches fiction in the creative writing program at Princeton University. The books will be available for purchase through our store. Phone us, email us, or stop in to pick up a copy of both copies. We have signed book plates, and Mike came in to sign his personally. I saw him do it. Please come by. We'll be happy to sell them to you. We encourage those of you that tuned in, as I said earlier, to keep your cameras on, but please make sure to mute yourselves. We'll take questions about 45 after, so keep those ready at the handy. Now I'm going to step away and hand it off to our wonderful guests.
Thank you.
Enjoy the show, you guys.
Thank you. I'll scooch over. Wow, 3D, kind of, yeah. Idra, thank you so much for joining us from New York.
Oh, thank you, and happy paperback release day. I don't know how many people coming for the paperback release have read the book yet, but I think one of the reasons it really took off this year was that it was a year in which we were really realizing how much books keep us alive, and also how virtual life can kind of take us through books, as an event like this can do, all over the world. And your book did both of those things. And
Yeah.
when I was reading it, and I love how meta the book is, and Mike and I have talked about this. I love the book within a book and how a book can both be its own journey and also have all these other journeys and literary text embedded inside, what this book does with spades. And I was thinking, reading this novel, and I wanted to get as a first question to your thoughts on this, that Elliot Weinberger, who's a translator, has a quote where he says, you know, a piece of writing dies when it has nowhere else to go, in terms of languages or in terms of countries. And I thought that that applied to sort of like the animated life of this lost book in your novel, that it stays alive because it has more places to go. And that in some ways becomes kind of the driving energy in the book, that you created this book and that we as your readers get to relish this experience of seeing its life go on in that way. That means that a book doesn't die because it has somewhere else to go.
Yeah. Oh, first off, I love that question and the idea of like things that have nowhere to go. I mean, I think I'm always like very suspicious of borders. You know, I'm very suspicious. So personally, personally being biracial, being first generation, being from Chicago, I think the concept of borders, like just in a very, very emotional way as a kid, confused me. You know, writing. And I started reading writers in translation, surely Latin American literature, and surely a lot of European literature and Asian literature, because I felt like essentially as someone who was biracial, who was first generation, not quite sure what it meant to be American. And so suspicious of the borders and the cultural borders and the political borders that are put in place to define Americans. Like as a kid, I remember having this second or third grade teacher who was like a spiritual devotee of Ronald Reagan. And it was like the first time in my life I felt suspicious of sort of like what a teacher was saying as far as this is what a story is, this is what grammar is, because it was very much embedded in what it means to be an American. And politically, sort of sovereignty and borders are really new. You know, like 1800s, the nation state was invented. So sitting down to write, wasn't consciously imbued like the novel with these things, but I think it sort of just happened in the sense of writing towards the things I was always suspicious of. And if there's anything that's able to obviously transcend borders and people, it's narrative. It doesn't have to be a novel, but the stories that traverse the oceans with immigrants and the stories that help sort of define political movements. I think it's just a powerful engine to step over borders.
Well, in a way, this felt to me like an inherently post-national book, and that you're a post-national writer. One, because you don't see yourself confined to any particular country or language. So there's a way that this book, represents this kind of like post-national way of thinking, where like the patria of this book is kind of like narrative itself.
Yeah.
So
thank you. I mean, I think too, the thing that always interests me about sort of borders is like how much fiction goes into defining the borders, how much fiction goes into defining whatever country determines what it is. And these fictions are like I said, like so new, like mid to late 1800s is a relatively new historical time to like invent foods and musics and newspapers and a politics that just fictionalize and sort of create what it means to be a nation. Very, very suspicious of that. So, and I also think just being sort of blessed with translation. So you're a translator, and it's so funny because I remember a couple of years ago when I reached out to you, I was like in this manic episode of like reaching out to a few translators. Like, what do you do? How do you do it? It's amazing. Let's talk about it. And I surely was in the midst of writing the book, and the book's not about a translator, but sort of the email relationship we had and sort of like the literary relationship, I think was so happily formed because I was suspicious of borders, and I wanted to really like know more translators like yourself who were able to not only do that in their own work post-national, but bring works I would never otherwise get a chance to read, which is like a gift.
And you made up a book that we wouldn't otherwise get to read, except within the book that you did. And I was so curious, because in my first novel, I also have like books and books, and I think that's sort of like, if you're a bibliophile by nature, there's something where like the magic is always that a book will sort of take you to another book or another place. That like there's a journey that happens in words that's kind of like the beating heart of the book in some way, you know, that language is like ultimately what connects people, and so then you bring the reader into that. And that was really interesting. You know, you had made up this sort of woman writer who's back in history, and then it goes from country to place. And I wondered if you, working on this book and then thinking about it, if you already had a sense of the sort of like the volleys that would happen from country to country with this book, or you sort of figured them out as you went, because really create this amazing cyclone, you know, of this book that sort of like moves like a hurricane across America. So it's so beautiful to behold as a reader.
Yeah, you know, I think more in when I put it together, I think it was more step by step. You know, I think surely, like I have, for those people listening, I have family in Ecuador. My dad's from Ecuador, and my mom's family is about 100 years ago from Lithuania. So the Russian Jewish Pale. So those were embedded sort of in sort of like, I think what I learned about how to tell stories. You know, the dinner table was surely like my first literature. You know, before I knew books could do what they do, I knew from listening, you know, to debates at the dinner table in my Chicago Jewish family. I know from going to Ecuador and sitting around and listening to people, listening to family tell stories and jokes that last 45 minutes, and, you know, getting these like embedded ways when you're young on how stories work. And it wasn't until later in high school and college where, you know, starting to realize stories in novels can function that same way. And through reading Latin American literature, through reading European literature in translation. So I just think, you know, is having a book in book and having it like traverse borders sort of just came, I think, just sort of naturally from listening. You know, in teaching, I often tell students that their greatest gift, and this is hard for me to say because I like talking, but their greatest gift is to shut up, listen, and ask people questions. Surely people have stories that traverse decades, continents, and lives. So I think the best thing for me in trying to write this book was to listen to the stories around me. And that's one end as far as storytelling. And the other end, and this is more sort of a subcurrent, what I recognized a little bit earlier in sort of trying to write about revolutions or trying to write about moments in which there is change, and usually collective change, not a type of individual change that we see in a lot of American storytelling. But sort of the consequences and the material consequences of capitalism work throughout the world in similar manners. Yeah. So whether it's the Russian Revolution or the Great Depression in Argentina, you know, decades and decades and decades later, the material fault lines of capitalism and the way people respond to them have similar tenors. And that to me felt like a comfortable place to write about people's lives.
Yeah, and I think you do. What's really special about this book is that you do create this collision between sort of personal change and collective change, and how one can beget or complicate the other. And I think that another thing I think so special about this novel, which I really loved, is that I think a lot of novels, as you were saying, that create this identity, that are about cultural identity, will often sort of like silo or try to like create a neat discussion of like one identity and one aspect of a person. And you just sort of bring in all these things and don't try and isolate or detangle them from each other. You know, there's a stop in Tel Aviv and there's a stop in Uruguay, and, you know, they're all part of the same narrative, as opposed to trying to sort of like isolate these distinctive cultural chapters and separate the Jewish chapter from the Ecuadorian chapter. That you kind of create a place for all of them to kind of enrich each other and allow for what maybe sort of like is this sort of like conglomerate of all these different influences, like what you said happened. And I think sometimes I see, you know, writers, especially with first novels, where they think that they need to create, as you said, sort of this like fiction that's like this coherent narrative, when actually that's not what a table sounds like. That's not what most lives look like. And I think the vitality of your book is in part because you allowed all of those in at once, you know, to the same book. So I think that's hard to pull off. So
thank you. You know, I think too, I never, it's something I never, and it's something I'm also a little suspicious of, what we're in a sense, when you're looking at political solutions specifically and only through the lens of identity. Surely identity is critical to forming ourselves and collectives and sort of how we interact with the world. But, again, I grew up with Assyrian refugees. I grew up with a lot of biracial kids who half Black, half Puerto Rican, half white, half Asian. So there was a lot around me of kids, young people, and surely through our maturity and staying friends growing up, where a singular identity didn't quite make sense. And specifically when I taught high school, I had students who were refugees in their own city, kicked out of communities and neighbors because they were LGBTQ, or because they had a kid, or because they had health crises in their own lives. And so I think this accumulation of experiences in which not one identity can summarize some person's life. These weren't things I thought I wasn't thinking too consciously of in the process of writing, which is so messy. And, you try to write sentence by sentence, but I think what emerges is a type of American experience, hopefully, like we were talking about, like without those borders. And surely the way things work on the street is not like Twitter. It's like very like it's an antithesis of Twitter. I remember I tell the story a few times, like the times I was able to visit my dad's work and work with him in Jewelers Row here in Chicago, which is not too far from where this gorgeous bookstore is right now. And, the people who would come in and speak to my dad, or the people who I'd visit to drop off jobs with, were from all over Latin America. And occasionally, since jewelry business in Chicago was an old world Jewish business, occasionally individuals who were from the old world. And so these were everybody. This was Jewelers Row is a individualized collective in which people have their own businesses, but the engine of it functions because of so many different exiles and immigrants and people with stories and people willing to share their stories. So it never made sense to me to try to isolate, almost in a suburban way, I am this one thing. And so my writing projects would be that one thing. It never interested me as much, almost by accident.
But I also think what you did is more emotionally true. And I think that's why the book has really taken off and found a lot of readers, because it feels emotionally true. It feels more organic and sort of adherent to sort of the post-national place that I think, more and more people in this country live in, or live here and then, live elsewhere. And one thing we talked about when I spoke with Mike last, which I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, because we just touched on it, was your instinct to write without quotation marks.
Oh, yeah.
As usually happens in Latin American fiction.
Yeah.
And I also did that, and neither of us expected that to cause so much commotion among readers who usually, their usual diet for novels would be books that were written or went through, the English in language in such a way that there is quotation marks. And I thought it was really interesting that you also received some email of people who were quite disconcerted at the lack of quotation.
Yeah. For me, it was something I didn't even quite think about. So like the novel itself takes place alternating between two sections. There's a historical section in which I do use quotation marks. It felt more traditional. It felt more like sort of like using quotation marks to me felt like the black and white photographs. So I was like, let's go with this. Yeah. And writing the contemporary sections, which closely sort of hovers over this character, Saul, who's a refugee from Tel Aviv, and his best friend's an Ecuadorian journalist, it didn't make sense to the architecture of writing. And I think on hindsight, a lot of it was just the influence of just reading Latin American literature all the time and trying to think of ways in which how American sort of narrative can be sort of like partically fused with the Latin American traditions, sort of like as a fun experiment in writing. But I didn't think too much of it. My editor, my wonderful editor at Hanover Square Press, didn't think too much of it. And then I received like a handful of like hate mail because I wasn't using quotation marks. Like, how did you get published? Or what the hell is this? Or like infamously, one email was just a short line that says use damn quotation marks already. And I was like,
I also received such an email.
This is so much energy embedded in like the use of quotation marks, which I like the way, I just physically like the way it looks. If you have a book where it's a little bit talky, or you have interruptions in conversations, or you have ways in which conversations lead to sort of like the architecture of the book, not just sort of like dialogue that we would see on stage, for example. It just felt good. I don't know why.
Because I think you can do like a short quote and then chase it with a summary of something longer that was said.
Yeah.
And it just gives you sort of like a little more leverage or room to sort of play around with what you do with the conversation, and it doesn't stand out as much. And I think what you did was really interesting, that like the quotation marks belong to sort of one time period within the novel, and that was one of the ways that you moved in time. And I wonder what it's been like for you reading from this novel and reading from these sections that move across the world and across time. And how would you be reading a little bit for us tonight, perhaps, at the paperback launch? If there's a section maybe that's read differently to you, having, you know, shared this novel with the world, both virtually and, across this crazy year. Would you read a passage for us? Maybe one from two different sections?
Yeah. Should we do, since we're talking about reading, let's do this, since we're talking sort of about the discovery of narratives. I'll just read a quick two pages about sort of like the discovery of reading, which comes before narrative. So just to quickly set this up, this is the Dominicana, who's a Dominican refugee in New Orleans with her son, Maxwell, who has a terrible propensity for wandering. So, which feels, now that I have two toddlers, I get it more. I was doing revisions after our first kid, and I was like, oh, okay, I know what the wandering really is. And then, so this is that, and then her husband, the last pirate of the New World. So this is to help with the wandering. Yet one thing did seem to work. Maxwell's mother noticed that when Maxwell had a book directly in front of him, he was less prone to wandering. She took him back to the library, and at the library, she met a librarian named Afra or Anan, depending on who was speaking to her. So for example, visitors to the library or city officials called her Anan, but family members and friends, of whom she had many, called her Afra. Her husband was the only person who called her Afra, which was really the same as Afra, but her husband pronounced the A with a lilt that could only be described as the lilt of someone who is deeply in love. She was half Persian and half Haitian, and she made it a point to tell the Dominicana that she had lived in the Marigny, which in the 19th century was full of Haitian refugees and which was now full of mixed families, musicians, and writers. Afra spoke of Haiti in the same way other people spoke of violent love affairs. And more than a few times, she said that St. Peter would never let her through the gates of heaven on account that she would be incredibly bored there. Heaven would be like a very boring Port-au-Prince, she would say, one without the madness of survival, one without the sea, one without women like her mama who curve swelled with the seasons. The Dominicana and Afra quickly became close friends. She called Maxwell a little island mestizo, and she called his mother the kindest Dominicana she had ever met, which was the truth. At first, Afra gave the Dominicana spoken English lessons at the library every Wednesday and Friday afternoon. Later, in addition to the library lessons, Afra would visit the Dominicana each Monday night at her home on Malpanin Avenue. They would eat red beans and rice, and then Afra would read out loud for the Dominicana and her son. Translated into Spanish, she read Persian poetry, Assyrian myths, Greek myths, and African myths. She read the poetry of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and the fables of José Núñez de Cáceres, the Dominican revolutionary. She read Latin American pastorals, modern poetry, indigenous novels, which the librarian said were all simulacrums of Don Quixote. That book, she explained, was the one from which all others were endlessly replicated. So of course, she also joyfully read Don Quixote for the Dominicana and her son. Translated into English, she read a slim Russian novel titled We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. She read British plays and American short stories. She read the horrifying and elegant works of Edgar Allan Poe. She also read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Moby Dick, which the librarian suggested would help the Dominicana make sense out of the American character. The American character, the librarian theorized, was obsessed with movement and tyranny like a madman, different from the European character, which was obsessed with systems and order, like a lieutenant, and also very different from the Latin American character, which was obsessed with the abyss of time, Aztec labyrinths, and the Minotaur who wandered both. The madman, the lieutenant, and the Minotaur, the librarian said, constituted the entire history of the New World. In time, by listening to each word and following along with Afra's smiling eyes, the Dominicana learned how to read. I'll stop there.
Ugh. It's such a rich, multi-layered section that sort of tells, as I think many of this sort of, these sort of like gem-like sections of the book where all these different characters come into the book. It's like a large cast of characters, and yet they each sort of feed into each other's narratives. And also each of them, as you said, has like all these different names, and the book comes by different names depending on when it happens. And how did you keep track of it all? I mean, I think just thinking, and also how embellished the characters are, how much vitality, even for a character like Afa, and like coming up with all this ways that different people say her name, it just brings her to life and gives her this humanity. And I think that you render each character that way in the book, which when you have a cast that large, is really quite a feat.
Thank you. I wrote very slowly. I think it took like 6-7 years. Obviously life has other things, I was teaching and had a kid or two in there, one. But no, thank you. I think in essentially like when telling stories about exiles and refugees, I think materially you're bound to other people in a way that you're not otherwise, right? You could hear some sirens outside. And so I think it was important for me, like not only reflecting on that and how that impacted my own life, but being emotionally and materially bound to a community, for better or worse. It's not always a solidarity situation. It's not always, communal adventures against capitalism or the patriarchy. There are complicated ways in which movements and people move in any given community. But for surely you're emotionally and materially connected to other people. And so I think very much in sort of the American Hollywood narrative, the individual sort of becomes the hyper object, right? Or the superstar, which makes sense if you have like Ursula K. Le Guin called it like sort of the gladiatorial view of fiction, where you center the individual, they reach a climax, they defeat something or someone, and they have an atonement, sort of the traditional narrative arc. And it's sort of a story that only empires can tell. So I think if you're suspicious of empires, what's happening in American fiction right now is just revelatory and amazing, where it's not so much we get to hear other voices, there is light on voices that have been telling these stories for hundreds of years. The predominant narrative in America often is not what we see or even what we read. It's dinner tables and communities and stories in response to empire, things have been happening for millions of years. So in a way, I have a good friend. I always say this, I have a good friend, Walita Cannon, and she said this all the way back in high school, and she's a Syrian, and I've thought about it for decades since, and people have written about it since, but this idea of like the empire coming home. And so this ways in which sort of the American military has destabilized other countries, surely Latin America, surely Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. And so it's sort of like that act of destabilizing that has created an unreality in a lot of countries, and I think the literature in other countries in some ways have seen things for worse political reasons, than we have for some decades. And so now the empire comes home, the money comes home, the militarization comes home. And I think Americans, readers and viewers of films are starting to understand sort of what the consequences of that unreality is. That being said, America has this extraordinary tradition of Black, Latino, mixed, and Asian writers that has been happening for 200 years, but have not had the light. And so now the light put on them. And so now there's so much unreality and instability that I think literature is rapidly changing in our country because of
yeah,
it. So.
And in an exhilarating way. And I think what happens is that although you can talk with passion about all of these changes and the way that they're happening, this sort of seismic cultural shifting way, you can also bring alive a moment in a library of someone coming to read, and with the specificity of what those books are in a way that isn't dogmatic, that isn't didactic, and there's like a tenderness and just this one scene that I think is kind of the thread through the whole book, that even when the characters are complicated or sort of fail each other in some way, that you write about all the characters, you know, with tenderness, so that, you know, it doesn't, even though you're writing about rebellion, I think there's a tenderness in the book that you know, didactic or passion of some of the characters doesn't necessarily gobble up the book, and it doesn't take on the sort of, did you have some ways where there was, you know, maybe some element of that, where you sort of getting into the larger politics that was sort of fueling the novel, but then realized that you had to sort of let the characters do what they needed to do as people?
You know, I think at core, like, I'm not a political writer. I'm interested in sort of the material conflict that sort of political events have, but also like there's this, you know, something I've thought about. A close friend of mine who read it, was a very astute reader, somebody I really trust. He had said something I'd never quite thought about, was thankful, but I was really thankful for his insight into it. He said, you managed to do one of the hardest and most boring things, is that show, given the chance, people are good to each other.
Yes.
And I think when thinking about narrative, maybe it's harder to do that, but I had, you know, I think just by the sheer reaction to political forces and seeing, given the opportunity, people are good to each other, given the opportunity. I mean, otherwise society would have collapsed, you know, 2,000 years ago. We're able to somehow subsist with tenderness and in a non-ironic and sincere and loving way that not only sustains stories, but sustains the communities that tell the, you know, sustains communities that can have the opportunity to tell their stories.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting thing a friend said that, because I think that's definitely true of this novel. Just, you know, following like Saul across the course of the book, there is the sense that displacement is heartbreaking, but beautiful things still happen. And I think your novel kind of holds those two truths at once, you know, the heartbreak and also the beautiful things that occur within his lifetime. Yeah. Alongside the heartbreak, you know.
And you know, when I was writing this, you know, subconsciously or not, when I was writing this, I was teaching dropouts in Chicago and Shirley, so very involved in day-to-day lives of students who had been, for worse, exiled, but for better, had found a school or an environment that, you know, would help them. And these are students who, like I said earlier, were sort of exiled from their lives, but the ways in which they treated each other when there was like dire need, homelessness, or being kicked out of a house, or surely having to work night shifts and missing schools. You know, there were thousands of acts of kindness. You know, I always joke, like, in the exterior, I'm definitely a nihilist. You know, like, the universe is going to end, the world's going to end. You know, there's a finite nihilism and everything. But at its core, like, we're sort of like stuck being human. So like these thousands and thousands of acts, I think, layer community more than I love journalism, but more so than anything can handle, except maybe art. Yeah.
And I think there's like the largeness of the book, the scope of the canvas that you cover, you know, like how post-national the book is sort of gives that sense that you know, that within art, there is room for all these different narratives to make each other visible.
Yeah.
You know, that, and there could be a book where and I think there are books like this. I would name the word, like, sometimes it's like one narrative takes priority over another. But I think in this book, one of the beauties is you sort of give equal priority to everyone's narratives. You know, like you don't sort of let one sort of like rise over the other. There's like this choral effect of all these lives sort of colliding with each other. And in the way that I think sort of like human lives happen and weather happens, you know, it felt very 21st century to me.
Yeah,
I think that's why it like resonated with lots of readers and has taken off as a book, because it felt very much of our century. You know, you weren't imposing, as I said before, any sort of neat sense of sort of like, you know, extracting one neat narrative, because you know, you didn't do that. You let it all, you opened the door and let it all in.
Well, I'm easily distracted. So by the time I write a few pages about somebody, I want to know about somebody else. So, but I thank you for that. I mean, I think I was always interested in sort of how communities work, and I was hopeful that some of that came through.
But I think that what you do in a polyphonic novel like this is that there's something inherently democratic about it. because you're not saying that this person has the truth and then you're, I mean, like there's something inherently democratic about your approach to the book. You know, we get to see how all.
Sure, that's like one of the nicest things ever. Can I put that like on a slogan when I get frustrated with writing like that? Thank you. I'm gonna put that.
But I think there is. I mean, all characters have a blind spot, but if you don't hear another character, you don't figure out what the blind spot is. But because we get to hear this sort of polyphonic story, we figure out how one blind spot impacts another, which I think is like something that's really special about, you know, multi-voice fiction.
Thank you. And it has like, it also has, if you're looking at polyphonic voices and the idea of sort of like the fabric of like multi-narratives, I feel, and I'm not a literary historian, but in my small experience of reading and trying to understand stories throughout history, it feels like the predominant narrative in storytelling was that.
Yes.
Then, you know, then comes along sort of Western literature, and specifically literature from the United States was highly individualized. But, you know, even looking at sort of like Aztec codices, or, you know, looking at sort of like oral traditions from the Middle East, were just naturally polyphonic in their telling. It feels like more multi. Say it again.
The Old Testament is multi-voiced.
Like insanely so. It's like the consciousness is like, it's like hypnotizing and frustrating at the same time, because it's, yeah, but it's a sort of like, surely in the Jewish tradition too, the narrative of, you know, not only just the pogrom and the crossing, but like sort of like you're forced when you're exiled from a country you don't have or didn't exist, you know, before mid-century, 20th century, you, by necessity, you have these stories because they sort of sustain the fiction sort of a people. And yeah, it's interesting to me. Like I was looking at the other day, like Aztec storytelling and codices and sort of myth making, and how they were inherently trying to tell the story of a people and not the individual. And when it is the individual, it's these gods who like fuck everything up. You know, it's like the individual super truth is the thing that really makes life hard for, you know, people, you know, just trying to farm or hang out with their family.
Oh, and they're asking if anyone has questions. Is there someone who would like to ask a question? Yes. Well, I will ask you a question, and then as maybe some questions come into the chat box. What I think it can happen when you do a first novel where you sort of bring your whole life to it. You know, like when you write a first novel, everything, everywhere you've lived, every character you come across, you know, students who touched you, lives that have touched yours, you really brought in that whole polyphonic of being yourself into this novel. And then when you start a second novel, you sort of have like, of course, that whole backstory, but then you have like basically 2 years to pull from, or 3 years to pull from, because you've devoted, I don't know how many decades of living, you know, that you pour in that way to the first novel. So I'm wondering maybe if you can let us know a little bit, you know, I know you were in with 2 kids in quarantine during the pandemic.
Yeah. So no real like sort of like substantive writing for 15 months, but it did teach me, you know, I had, you know, just to sort of talk about the day-to-day of trying to write another novel. You know, surely everything sort of, and during the pandemic, I think we were all forced into this interiority. I've been thinking a lot about how, you know, modernist literature was sort of this explosion post-pandemic, post-World War I, but not a lot of literature was specifically about the pandemic. But I've been musing lately about how it forced people inside, and truly forced literature. You know, you have these novels all of a sudden that are like 150-page monologues, like post-1918 pandemic. You have the completely revolutionized way in which literature works. And so I've been talking to other writers and seeing things that have been recently be published, or talking to people. And it feels like something has shifted. I don't know what, but it made me surely throw away, you know, 80 pages of another novel and really consider how to rewrite, stepping outside of the pandemic. So I have been mining more, not the pandemic, but mining more, what does it feel like to be trapped in a singular interiority? So I'm writing a novel about the future set in 2050 about a census taker who was imprisoned in a black site. And so he tells his sort of story how he gets involved and accidentally in sort of this rebellion in Chicago, and how he tries to track down his mother who disappeared in the Amazon. And she's an ecologist, but just, I wanted to figure out how to tell a story as a monologue to an ant, to an ANT who wanders into this black site prison. And it feels like maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I think stepping outside of this pandemic, I'm less concerned with how things work and more just like as an experiment in trying to sort of untangle this interiority that we've all been stuck in for too long.
Yes,
if that makes sense. There's a lot of rambling about a monologue I'm attempting to write, so it seems appropriate.
Yeah, I think we all were living a monologue for this year, but I also think there'll be a way that this book coming out in paperback is a great opportunity for people who want more company, who are like, breaking free of the monologue of 2001 and really want to be in a party. And this book is very much a party, It's like,
and now's the time to party for sure.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be in, experience all these voices in these lives and watch this book sort of like move across time. And this I kept thinking about that Elliot Weinberger, because I think you sort of track that in your interest in translation, maybe whether is that sense of like, how does a book stay alive, as it moves across lives and something, and how does that book's life reflect on the people who find it?
Yeah. It was always, because it transcends not just, sort of like a year or two, but, anyone stepping into their library or the books they've read, there's sort of just like this immediate sort of metaphor of what you read becomes very literally a part of you. Books, I still believe truly like quantumly affect people and change them. And I'm not saying change for the better. I don't think there's a moralistic principle in being a reader or not being a reader. I just think sitting down with books quantumly affect the way you think about the world. And so to have that, it was really like a fun game and really a fun thing to explore, to have a book that passed through so many decades in people's lives. And
also gets sent and doesn't get there and comes back, which I think like that boomerang thing felt very emotionally true for what does happen with books, is that it can, manuscript a book can be sent out in the world and then the receiver doesn't get it and the book comes back and it has to go out to another receiver. And I felt like that was felt emotionally true to the life of a book, which is sometimes you put something out there into one person and it actually is destined for another, Yeah,
it bounces back. And it's sort of like novels that I'm also sort of like, it's a very traditional thing in Latin American literature, but I'm always sort of like fascinated with novels that are imaginary and that we don't know and that we've wanted to write. Surely, Roberto Bolaño touches on it because of Borges touches on it. I think, we were in conversation earlier with the class about Clarice Lispector, who's just one of my top 5 writers. And while she doesn't necessarily touch upon books that weren't written, she absolutely touches upon inner lives that were never expressed. And that feels like, to me, sort of revelatory, to know that there's novels that have never been published that would have been world changing, to know that there have been writers who, given one circumstance or another, would have been able to publish. It just feels to me not like a hidden history, not like telling lives that should have been told, but sort of the possibility of lives and the possibility of what stories can contain, like endless.
Well, there is a Borgesian quality to this novel, and yet it also feels like, more democratic than Borges, who I think really keeps a strong hold on the omniscient narrator. And you sort of are happy to pass the baton, let your characters sort of take front stage, in the foreground. So in a way, it's Borgesian, but it also feels not aristocratic in the way that Borgesian.
Yeah. He was very correct, and also he had a weird political turn towards the end. But I think, I think one of the enduring lessons I've ever sort of like in reading a lot of reportage from the 1970s and 80s. I read a lot of reportage in writing this book from the 1970s and about the Argentine Great Depression in 2000. And there was something that struck me about reportage in Latin America was sort of this undercurrent through a lot of what I was reading, and the sensibility that when people report events, they're telling more about themselves than the events. The ways in which events are told is more of a memoir, is more of cast sort of a portrait on the teller than the event itself. And so that I think can be a democratic principle. I think it's embedded in sort of like the best reportage, in which we aren't just getting quotes from people who have suffered or getting quotes from people who have participated in a historical event, but the historical event is them. It's through their eyes that we see them, rather than having to make sense out of this large event, which is quantum, right? So many things happen in one given event, a revolution, a tragedy. It's almost impossible to understand. And so if we could at least understand people who lived through it, I think we could walk away with something better.
Yes, that's kind of seems like a great thought, to walk away with something better about this book. I'm trying to see if there's any questions. Would you maybe read a little section from the Argentina sections where we get to hear a little bit about sort of seeing that where you incorporated that and that notion of how this sort of tracking of lives within the novel. I think there is something very hopeful about this novel. There's an optimism to it, and that tenderness, I think, comes through throughout.
Absolutely, yeah. And I have to find, I had the pages almost memorized, but the paper book, the pages are different. So give me one second, and I'm absolutely happy to read. Yes, I'll read a quick. Yeah.
It's okay. Don't worry about
Okay.
that. It's not okay. So
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, we'll do like 2 pages. That sound good?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So this is Javier, who's a journalist. He's an Ecuadorian American journalist, and he's in Argentina. And then he is with his fixer Alejandro in Argentina during the Great Depression there in 2001. And this is just in the middle of sort of protest and sort of interviewing people. I think might be a good touchstone for that. And this is from Alejandro's voice. So I hired Alejandro as a fixer, continued Javier, and over the next 2 months, he helped me set up interviews with laid off researchers, teachers, waitresses, oil workers, 2 priests from the Church of San Cayetano who were helping the unemployed, and a night watchman for a bank who told me he kept all of his savings in a small lacquered box along with his great-grandmother's glass eye. All over the city, like a shared dark secret, people were afflicted not only with the python-like constrictions of austerity, but also by fears of a literary and political nature. That is, Pana, they were fears that afflicted both the self and the body politic, so that a person had trouble distinguishing one from the other. Fears of the self clothed in the flesh of the state. As people waited in long bank lines or struggled to feed their families, they were once again asking themselves, could I really push an enemy of the state from a plane into the bloodless sea? Could I risk being disappeared for my beliefs in a better life? One afternoon, we went to a Chinese restaurant where he introduced me to 3 former oil workers who told me about the oil town scrapped and abandoned after the privatization of the state-run oil company, YPF, in June of 1933. I asked them what they thought of the future of the country. One of the former oil workers said, a better question is, in what kind of country are we living in right now? A country full of orange-faced chantas like Menem and De La Rue, said the man to his left, hollow men willing to sell anything they could get their hands on. A country half in love with Peronism and half in love with death, said the man to his right. A center with no labyrinth, said Alejandro, quickly. See, the former oil worker said to me, how can we talk of the future when this is a country with no future, a country entirely dependent on the false myth of inexhaustible wealth, just like your country, Che. A wealth once so great that my dad, who worked the pampas his entire life, told us as kids that you could kill any cow you wanted out of thousands just to eat the tongue. Some days later, Alejandro invited me to go with him and his family on a day trip to San Antonio, just 70 miles outside of the city. His wife, Eden, was tall, had big green eyes and shoulder-length black hair combed straight. She drove and Alejandro sat next to her. I sat in the back with her 3-year-old daughter, Sophia, who wore large, round black sunglasses that hid her eyes and half her forehead like a Mexican actress from the 60s. We headed northwest through the empty pampas. To pass the time, Eden told jokes that stretched like rubber bands until at some point, Alejandro and Sophia would explode into fits of laughter. I remember thinking then, or maybe I'm only thinking it now, Pana, that this is what happy families did as they drove long distances. They told jokes and invented stories that made sense only to them, creating a rarefied sense of space and time all their own. By comparison, I felt rootless, mute. We checked in at the Estancia cattle ranch just a few miles west of San Antonio's main plaza and spent the afternoon with a few other families watching horse races and a gaucho sport involving crossbeams and small rings called corrida. Afterwards, we bought ice cream bars and walked around. There was an outdoor pool, a playground, a large ring barbecue pit, and a small lagoon crowded with noisy migratory birds. As we walked, Alejandro held his daughter in his arms and talked to her about the things they had seen that day. Despite all the excitement, or maybe because of it, she fell asleep, still holding but loosely the small wooden stick from her ice cream bar, her head resting on the crook of Alejandro's sunburned neck. Alejandro kissed her forehead, which was damp with sweat. The sky turned violet, and there were prairie shadows towards the pampas. On the shores of the lagoon, we listened to the migratory birds as they called out to each other one by one. And I'll stop right there.
Oh, what a gorgeous section. And I feel like it hits on so many things we were talking about, and how you can go for these sort of philosophical questions of, are you willing to die for the better conditions in the country, or the self cloaked in the flesh of the state? What a gorgeous line. And then to have it all end up with the tenderness, of the daughter in the father's arms and the stick and the bird. And I think that's why this book, even though it asks these sort of hard questions and there is all this heartache, you create these moments where the reader sees these people in the immediacy of their love for each other, and it sort of transcends all the bigger questions while still holding them, at the center of the book. It's really a feat. I think it's an unusual first novel for so many reasons, and I hope people who came for the paperback launch who don't have a copy yet will pick up 1 copy, 2 copies, 3 copies, share them with friends who need a book to take with them for summer reading. Congrats.
Thank you, Idra, and thank you so much for joining tonight. For those out there, please pick up. Idra is a phenomenal translator, also a novelist. I think when I finished your novel, I emailed you like a page or two of like my thoughts. Just beautiful. Those who knew is latest. And so I just admire your work so much. So I really appreciate your time here tonight. Thank you.
Oh, I love this. I feel like we have so many overlaps of things that we're both driven to write about. It's really wonderful to find another novelist who's sort of always thinking about how to leap from one country to another in different languages, and to keep the tenderness alongside the hard questions, how to keep them both in the same novel and be true to both. So this is such a delight. It's thundering and lightning here. It was great company to offset this crazy weather. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you all for coming. Visit us at the store. Come by, we pick up copies. This beautiful store. This is not a backdrop. We're actually here. We can actually feel and touch those plants. But yeah, come by, say hi, buy copies of both Idra's and Michael's book, both signed. And we'll be happy to ship them out wherever you live. Come by, say hi. Thanks everyone for showing up.
Javier, good one.
Thanks, Idra.
Bye-bye.